Welcome to the start of your journey toward becoming a licensed real estate professional in California. In this chapter, we will establish the foundational regulatory knowledge and operational requirements set by the Department of Real Estate. This course is an unofficial, independently produced study guide and is not affiliated with, endorsed by, or connected to the California Department of Real Estate, DRE, or any official testing body. This content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or tax advice. Always consult a qualified professional before making legal or financial decisions. Securing your license in the Golden State is a rigorous process that demands precision, commitment, and a deep understanding of the regulatory landscape. This course is designed to strip away the noise and focus exclusively on the high-yield information you need to pass the DRE examination. By synthesizing complex legal requirements into actionable knowledge, we turn daunting administrative hurdles into a structured study routine. You're not just preparing for a test. You're gaining the professional framework required to operate legally and effectively as a salesperson or broker. Your success in this industry begins with a comprehensive grasp of the Business and Professions Code, specifically sections 10,130 through 10177. These codes define the very scope of your professional practice, dictating how you interact with the public, manage trust funds, and maintain ethical standards. We will navigate the specifics of the application process, including fingerprinting and background checks, to ensure you meet state compliance standards without unnecessary friction. Understanding the DRE administrative rules is your first line of defense against future disciplinary actions and career-ending mistakes. The logistics of the licensing test are as important as the content itself, which is why we will cover exam schedules, ID protocols, and center policies. Many candidates focus solely on memorizing terms, but failing to understand the structure of the exam, such as the weighting of different topic categories, is a common path to failure. We will break down our text-based study methodology, which prioritizes core concepts over rote memorization to ensure you can apply your knowledge to situational exam questions. Mastery of these technical and legal domains serves as the bedrock for the subsequent chapters on property ownership, finance, and agency law. Beyond passing the test, this curriculum ensures you are prepared for the professional reality of real estate brokerage in California. We will explore the nuances of local zoning, property disclosure requirements, and the financial responsibilities inherent in holding client funds. This isn't just about obtaining a permit to practice. It is about establishing the competency needed to navigate the complexities of the California residential and commercial markets. With this foundation, you'll be equipped to tackle high-yield topics with confidence, knowing you possess the exact tools required by the regulatory authorities. I look forward to guiding you through these essential concepts in our next session. Welcome to this new chapter, where we will demystify the complex web of property rights and legal interests that define California real estate ownership. By the end of this module, you'll possess a complete mental model of land usage, enabling you to pass the DRE licensing test with confidence. To understand property in California, we must start by distinguishing between real property and personal property. Real property includes the land itself, everything permanently attached to it, and the legal rights that come with ownership. Personal property, or chattels, refers to movable items that are not permanently affixed to the land. A fixture is a piece of personal property that has been attached to the real property in a way that it becomes part of the land. When disputes arise regarding whether an item is a fixture, we apply the Maria test. This mnemonic stands for method of attachment, adaptability, relationship of the parties, intent of the party who attached it, and agreement between the parties. Intent is generally considered the most critical factor in this test. Recognizing these distinctions is essential for identifying what exactly is being conveyed in a real estate transaction. Ownership rights in California are often described as a bundle of rights. This metaphor suggests that ownership is not a single, indivisible concept, but a collection of distinct legal privileges. The primary components of this bundle include the right of possession, the right to transfer, the right of enjoyment, the right to exclusion, and the right of control. Each of these rights can be separated and individually sold, leased, or limited by contract or law. For example, a landowner might grant a utility company the right to cross their land, thereby limiting their exclusive control. Understanding how these rights function allows you to determine the scope of a property owner's authority in any given set of circumstances. We categorize interests in land into two primary groups based on their duration and ownership characteristics: freehold estates and non-freehold estates. A freehold estate implies an ownership interest that is for an indefinite duration, meaning it could last forever. The most common form is fee simple absolute, which represents the highest form of ownership in California law. Conversely, a defeasible fee is an estate that may terminate if a specific condition or event occurs, as stated in the deed. Life estates are another form of freehold interest that terminate upon the death of a designated person. If the estate is tied to the life of someone other than the holder, it is called a life estate per Otravi. When a life estate ends, possession reverts to the original grantor, known as a reversionary interest, or passes to a third party, known as a remainder man. Non-freehold estates, often referred to as leasehold estates, represent a tenant's interest in property rather than full ownership. An estate for years has a fixed term with a specific beginning and ending date, despite its name, and does not require notice for termination. A periodic tenancy automatically renews at intervals, such as month to month, and continues until one party gives proper notice. An estate at will allows a tenant to occupy property for an unspecified period with the landlord's consent, which can be terminated at any time. Finally, an estate at sufferance occurs when a tenant stays beyond their lease term without the landlord's permission, effectively making them a holdover occupant. Knowing these classifications is fundamental to interpreting rental agreements and potential future interest claims. Protecting title and ensuring clear ownership is a central pillar of California real estate law. Recording Acts mandate that documents affecting title be entered into public records to provide constructive notice to the world. Constructive notice implies that a diligent search of the public record would reveal the claim, whereas actual notice means a person is explicitly informed of the interest. A chain of title provides a chronological history of ownership, which is scrutinized to ensure a marketable title. A cloud on the title exists when there is a defect or potential claim that diminishes the owner's ability to transfer property. When such clouds appear, owners often pursue a quiet title action, which is a court proceeding meant to resolve competing claims and establish clear ownership. Establishing this legal clarity is a necessary prerequisite for any successful conveyance of real estate in our state. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Let's dig into the fundamental concepts of encumbrances, liens, and various forms of easements in California real estate. An encumbrance is a claim, right, or interest held by someone other than the owner that limits the fee simple title to real property. While a property might be transferred even with an encumbrance, it is crucial to understand that these financial or non-financial burdens affect the value and use of a land. Encumbrances are generally categorized into two main groups: those that affect the physical use of the property and those that affect the title financially. When we talk about liens, we are dealing with financial encumbrances that act as a security interest for a debt. A lien effectively creates a cloud on the title, ensuring that a creditor can satisfy their claim through the sale of the asset if the owner fails to meet their financial obligations. It is useful to distinguish between specific liens, which attach to a particular parcel of real estate, and general liens, which attach to all personal and real property owned by the debtor. Specific liens often include items like mortgages, where the borrower voluntarily pledges the property as collateral. Mechanics liens are a particular point of focus in California, allowing contractors, laborers, or material suppliers to secure payment for improvements made to the property. If a homeowner fails to pay for a kitchen remodel, the contractor may file a mechanics lien to secure their interest in the specific property where the work was performed. Tax liens, including property tax liens and special assessments, represent priority claims that typically override other encumbrances regardless of when they were recorded. Conversely, general liens are broader in scope, such as a judgment lien resulting from a court decree for unpaid money. Even an income tax lien, which is created by statute for unpaid taxes, serves as a general lien that attaches to everything the taxpayer owns, not just the real estate specifically involved in the debt-creating event. Beyond financial claims, we must consider easements, which are non-possessory interests in the land of another. An easement appurtenant involves two tracts of land: the dominant tenement, which benefits from the easement, and the servient tenement, which is burdened by it. For example, if a landlocked parcel requires a driveway across a neighbor's lot to reach a public road, that access right is an easement appurtenant that stays with the land regardless of who holds the deed. An easement in gross, by contrast, is a personal right to use land, such as a utility company needing access for power lines, which does not benefit a neighboring parcel. Understanding the distinction between these types is vital, because an easement appurtenant is traditionally transferred automatically with the deed, whereas an easement in gross is often tethered to a specific person or business entity. Easements can be created in several ways, including express grant, implication, or necessity. An easement by necessity arises when a property is severed in a way that leaves one part completely inaccessible without a right-of-way over the other, effectively forcing a legal allowance for ingress and egress. We also see easements by prescription, which are created through open, notorious, continuous, and hostile use of someone else's property for a statutory period, which in California is 5 years. Terminating an easement involves specific actions such as abandonment, where the dominant user stops utilizing the right for a sufficient duration, or the merger of the dominant and servient tenements into one owner. It is worth noting that if the necessity for an easement ceases to exist, the easement itself may also be extinguished, provided it was initially created based on that specific need. Encroachments occur when a structure or part of a structure unlawfully extends beyond the boundary of the owner's land onto the neighboring property. While a fence or a roof eave might seem minor, it remains a physical trespass that can complicate title transfers and lead to litigation if not addressed. Deed restrictions and covenants, conditions and restrictions, often abbreviated as CC and RS, are private land use controls that bind the owners of property within a subdivision or master plan community. These restrictions are generally placed in the original deed and are intended to maintain property values by enforcing standards on aesthetic choices, structure heights, or the usage of the land. Unlike local zoning ordinances imposed by the government, CC and RS are enforceable by other property owners within the development, usually through the homeowners association, creating a contractual obligation that persists as long as the deed is held. Government powers operate alongside these private interests, summarized by the acronym PEAT: police power, eminent domain, taxation, and escheat. Police power is the authority of the state to regulate public land use through zoning, building codes, and safety ordinances without providing compensation to owners. Eminent domain is the power of the government to take private property for public use, provided that just compensation is paid to the owner for the fair market value of the property. Taxation allows the government to generate revenue for public services through levies on real estate, while escheat occurs when a property reverts to the state if an owner dies intestate without any legal heirs. These powers are inherent to the state and serve as the backdrop for all private ownership in California, ensuring that individual rights are balanced against the broader needs of the public. Zoning is the primary method for local governments to control land use, segmenting areas into residential, commercial, and industrial districts to maintain orderly urban development. When an owner wants to use property in a way that violates prevailing zoning laws, they might seek a variance which allows a specific exception due to unique hardship, or a conditional use permit for activities that are allowed but require special scrutiny. You should also be aware of non-conforming uses, which occur when a property was being used for a purpose that was legal at the time but is now prohibited under new zoning laws. Such uses are often allowed to continue under a grandfather clause, but they cannot typically be expanded or significantly altered without conforming to the current regulations. Alongside these, building codes mandate minimum standards for construction, safety, and health, enforced through city or county inspections to protect the inhabitants of the structures. The Subdivision Map Act and the Subdivided Lands Law represent state-level regulations intended to protect consumers by ensuring that developers disclose all relevant details about a project. The Subdivision Map Act focuses on the physical geography and infrastructure of a development, forcing developers to get local approval for how land is divided and processed. The Subdivided Lands Law, however, is a consumer protection statute that mandates the issuance of a public report by the real estate commissioner. This report must be provided to prospective buyers and discloses information about title, utilities, and various financial risks associated with purchasing a lot in a newly subdivided tract. The oversight provided by these acts is rigorous, meant to prevent the sale of land that lacks basic services or has significant legal impediments at the time of purchase. Environmental regulations add another layer to land use, particularly in California, where geography presents unique challenges. The California Coastal Act provides a framework for protecting the state's coastline by requiring coastal development permits for projects in designated zones. Furthermore, California law requires disclosures for earthquake fault zones under the Alquist-Priolo Act, which restricts construction across active fault lines to minimize damage. The Special Studies Act mandates that developers investigate geological hazards to ensure homes are not constructed in areas prone to surface rupturing. Being knowledgeable about these environmental mandates is not merely about passing a test. It is about recognizing the physical limitations imposed by nature and the subsequent legal mandates designed to mitigate risks to human life. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to the chapter on methods of holding title. We will explore the various legal frameworks for property ownership and how these choices influence future transfers. When we approach the concept of holding title, we are essentially defining the legal relationship between the owners and the property itself. Ownership in severalty is the simplest form, where a single entity, whether an individual or a corporation, holds the title entirely to themselves. This means that the owner has sole control and total responsibility for the property, which simplifies decision-making but also concentrates all risks. In contrast, concurrent ownership involves two or more parties holding interest in the same property simultaneously. Understanding these distinctions is critical because the method of vesting directly impacts taxation, liability, and inheritance rights. When you select a vesting method, you're defining how the property will behave under the stress of legal disputes or the transfer of ownership upon death. Choosing the wrong structure at the moment of acquisition can lead to unintended probate consequences or complex tax burdens that are difficult to unwind later. Tenancy in common is a form of co-ownership where each owner holds an undivided interest in the property, and these interests do not need to be equal in size. If one party owns a 60% share and another owns 40%, both still maintain the right to occupy the entire premises. Crucially, there is no right of survivorship, meaning that when a tenant in common passes away, their share passes to their heirs rather than the remaining co-owners. This characteristic makes it a preferred choice for business partners or individuals who wish to control the inheritance of their specific property stake. Each owner can independently sell, mortgage, or transfer their interest without the consent of the others, provided they do not infringe upon the possessory rights of the other co-tenants. This flexibility comes with the risk that a co-owner could theoretically sell their interest to a stranger, forcing the other owners into a partnership they did not originally agree to. Joint tenancy offers a different set of dynamics, primarily defined by the four unities of time, title, interest, and possession. For a joint tenancy to exist, all tenants must acquire their interest at the same time through the same deed or instrument, with equal ownership shares and with an equal right to possess the entire property. The defining feature of joint tenancy is the right of survivorship, which ensures that if one owner dies, their interest automatically transfers to the surviving joint tenants. This mechanism effectively bypasses the probate process for the deceased individual's share of the property, which is a major advantage for simplifying estate administration. However, if one joint tenant transfers their interest to an outside party, the unity of title is broken and the joint tenancy is converted into a tenancy in common. Because of this, you must treat joint tenancy as a rigid structure that requires careful coordination among all parties involved at the very beginning of the ownership period. California recognizes community property as the default status for assets acquired through the labor or earnings of a married couple during the marriage. Each spouse is considered to own an equal 50% interest in community property, regardless of the relative financial contributions of each partner. Assets acquired before marriage, or those acquired via gift or inheritance during the marriage, are classified as separate property, provided they are kept distinct from community funds. California also allows for community property with a right of survivorship, which combines the tax advantages of community property with the probate avoidance benefits of joint tenancy. It is important to note that tenancy by the entirety is not recognized in California, so practitioners must rely on these specific local statutes to achieve similar goals. Domestic partners, under California law, often enjoy the same property rights and community property status as married spouses, which further shapes how title should be structured for a client's specific domestic situation. Legal entities, such as corporations, limited liability companies, and partnerships provide an alternative to individual ownership by shielding personal assets from lawsuits arising from property management. A corporation holds title in its own name, independent of its shareholders, which creates a distinct separation between management and ownership. Limited liability companies are frequently utilized in real estate because they offer a flexible management structure while providing the same liability protection as a corporation. Real estate investment trusts, or REITs, allow individuals to invest in large-scale, income-producing real estate without the burden of directly managing the underlying properties. When you advise clients on using these entities, you must consider the legal capacity of the signers and ensure the trust or company is validly formed under state law. These entities serve as professional vehicles for holding title that prioritize institutional security and the mitigation of individual risk. Trusts, particularly living trusts, act as a common tool for estate planning to manage assets and avoid the costs and delays of the probate court system. In a trust arrangement, the trustor transfers legal title to a trustee who holds and manages the property for the benefit of the designated beneficiaries. The trustee maintains a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the beneficiaries, ensuring that the property is preserved according to the terms set forth in the trust agreement. Land trusts are a specialized version used primarily for privacy or to manage fragmented interests in large plots of land where multi-owner oversight is required. Conveyance of real property into a trust must satisfy all statutory requirements for valid deeds, including proper notarization and clear identification of the trustee's authority. Failing to adhere to these formal requirements creates a cloud on the title, which will eventually impede any subsequent sale or financing attempt. I will see you in the next section. Welcome back. Today we begin our deep dive into the mechanisms through which the government regulates land use and exercises authority over private property. This chapter explores how local zoning, eminent domain, and taxation intersect with your client's ownership rights in California. At the most foundational level, local governments exercise their police power to regulate land use through a hierarchy of zoning classifications. These classifications are meant to implement a comprehensive or master plan, which serves as a long-term blueprint for community development. You will encounter standard zones such as residential, commercial, industrial, and agricultural, alongside specialized categories for public use. The critical point to grasp is that these zones dictate the density, structure, and permissible activities on any given parcel. Cities and counties utilize zoning maps to visually demarcate these boundaries, ensuring that incompatible uses, such as a heavy industrial plant next to a quiet residential neighborhood, are avoided. If a property owner finds that their intended use is not permitted, they may pursue a variance for unique hardships or seek a conditional use authorization to operate under specific constraints. Understanding how these requests are adjudicated will be necessary for navigating client expectations regarding property development. Beyond standard zoning, you must recognize the more restrictive or targeted methods of land use control like downzoning and spot zoning. Downzoning occurs when a city reduces the density or intensity of a permitted use, such as changing a high-density apartment zoning classification to single-family residential. While this is an exercise of governmental prerogative, it often triggers significant economic consequences for owners who expected higher utility from their land. Spot zoning, conversely, involves applying a different, often incompatible, zoning regulation to a small parcel of land within a larger, uniform zone. Courts generally treat spot zoning with skepticism because it can appear arbitrary and may unfairly favor or burden a specific owner. You should view these as significant shifts that alter the fundamental utility and market value of real estate in your portfolio. Keeping track of how these shifts align with a city's master plan is essential, as the courts often rely on this alignment to determine if the regulation is reasonable. Government influence on property also manifests through its power of eminent domain, which allows the state to take private land for public use, provided they meet strict constitutional requirements. The process involves the government issuing a formal condemnation action to acquire the title, but this is never a unilateral act of seizure. The Fifth Amendment mandates just compensation, meaning the government must pay the owner the fair market value of the property at the time of the taking. If an owner feels that their property's value has been impaired by government action, even without a direct taking, they may pursue inverse condemnation. This is essentially a lawsuit brought by the owner against the entity to force them to pay for the loss of value. Navigating the legal timeline of these proceedings is rarely your day-to-day work, but advising a client on the potential risks of a government project near their investment area remains a fundamental aspect of professional due diligence. Taxation is the final layer of governmental oversight that ties directly to your understanding of property ownership and finance. In California, Proposition 13 fundamentally altered our tax landscape by capping the assessed value of property at its acquisition price, plus a small annual inflationary adjustment. Ad valorem taxes, based on the assessed value, provide the primary revenue stream for municipal functions, while supplemental assessments catch up taxes when there is a change in ownership. You should be familiar with the property tax calendar, including tax lien dates, to ensure your clients understand when their financial obligations become an involuntary charge against the title. Beyond base property taxes, special assessments like Mello-Roos districts allow local governments to fund infrastructure through bond financing, which directly impacts the buyer's monthly cash flow. Recognize that these taxes follow the land rather than the individual, making them a primary item of investigation during every transaction you manage. We will see each other in the next session. Welcome to the chapter on legal descriptions, where we will examine how land is precisely measured and identified for legal conveyance. Understanding these systems is essential for any professional preparing for the California real estate examination. In this chapter, we will master the technical frameworks used to define property boundaries, starting with the metes and bound system. This method relies on physical monuments, distinct landmarks, and a designated point of beginning to trace the perimeter of a parcel. You will learn how modern refinements use benchmarks to ensure consistent elevation and positioning relative to established control points. We will also dive deep into the rectangular survey system, which is fundamental to understanding property division across the United States. By discussing meridians and baselines, we clarify how the grid system functions to organize land into townships and specific sections. This knowledge is not just theoretical, but a necessary requirement to master the nuances of California land measurement. The government survey system, often called the rectangular survey system, uses a grid of north-south lines, known as meridians, and east-west lines, known as baselines. In California, we specifically recognize three major starting points for this grid, which are the Humboldt, Mount Diablo, and San Bernardino meridians and baselines. Each township is a 6-mile by 6-mile square, subdivided into 36 sections, with each section covering 1 square mile or exactly 640 acres. You must become comfortable with calculating acreage based on these divisions, as it frequently appears in assessment scenarios. Understanding these geometric relationships allows you to read legal descriptions with confidence and identify the exact location of subject property. Errors in measuring these sections can lead to significant discrepancies in property valuation and taxation, which is exactly why the state mandates these rigid surveying standards. Beyond the grid system, the lot and block system, also known as the recorded plat system, is perhaps the most common way residential property is described in urban areas. This process begins with a subdivision map, which is a formal document created by a land surveyor and recorded with the county recorder. A developer files the recorded plat, which breaks a large tract of land into smaller lots and blocks, effectively creating a map that serves as the official legal description. When you look at a purchase agreement, the reference to a specific map book and page number is the primary identifier for that parcel. The county recorder's office maintains these documents to ensure clear identification and to provide a searchable trail of historical ownership. Without this formal recordation process, distinguishing between individual parcels in a dense development would be legally impossible and a recipe for boundary disputes. The roles and responsibilities involved in land surveying extend far beyond simple measurements, as they require professional certification and extreme accuracy. A licensed land surveyor acts as a technician who verifies existing boundaries, recovers old monuments, and creates new maps for recordation. Their work is the bedrock for the legal sufficiency in deeds and contracts, as any ambiguity in a description can invalidate the transfer of title. When we speak of physical versus legal descriptions, we are distinguishing between where a fence happens to sit and what the actual recorded coordinates mandate. Discrepancies often emerge during a survey, necessitating a careful review of parcel maps before closing a deal. Relying on an outdated or informal sketch is a critical failure that exposes you and your client to immense liability. Valid conveyance of real property requires strict adherence to legal formalities, starting with the drafting of a deed that satisfies the legal sufficiency criteria. Once the document reflects the correct description, it must be subject to clear delivery and acceptance to take effect legally. Furthermore, the document usually requires notarization or formal acknowledgement to be eligible for recording in the county office. The necessity for recordation stems from the need to establish priority of claims, letting the world know who holds the legal interest in the property. This process prevents fraudulent claims and provides a public history that is essential for title insurance companies. These companies issue policies that provide coverage against defects in title, often using an abstract of title as a condensed history of the property to assess risk. As part of the risk management process, title insurance may offer standard coverage or more comprehensive policies, such as Alta endorsements. These extra endorsements provide specific protections against unrecorded liens, easements, or survey errors that a standard policy might exclude. Understanding what is protected versus what is explicitly excluded from these policies is a high-level skill that sets top-tier agents apart from the rest. You must guide your clients to review these documents with the same scrutiny they apply to the financial contingencies of their purchase. By ensuring that every legal requirement is met from the initial survey to the final recording of the deed, you protect the client's largest asset. This technical rigor is precisely what the test expects of you, so maintain your focus on the accuracy of these procedural steps. I'll look forward to discussing the next topic with you. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will examine environmental hazards and the reporting requirements mandated by California law to protect property buyers and the public. Environmental stewardship in real estate is not merely a regulatory burden, but a fundamental component of professional risk management. When we discuss hazards such as asbestos, lead-based paint, or urea formaldehyde, we are essentially defining the boundaries of duty for a real estate licensee. Federal mandates like Title X require strict disclosure regarding lead-based paint in properties built before 1978, and failing to provide the proper documentation or the lead hazard pamphlet leave an agent vulnerable to significant legal repercussions. Similarly, the presence of radon gas or mold can materially affect the value and safety of a structure, necessitating that an agent understands when disclosure is required versus when it is merely recommended. The lead renovation, repair, and painting rule further complicates this by imposing specific work practices on contractors. Yet agents must be aware of these rules to ensure the sellers they represent remain compliant during pre-listing improvements. Understanding these physical hazards is the first step in ensuring that the transactional process remains transparent and legally defensible for all involved parties. Beyond common household toxins, we must contend with larger systemic issues, such as hazardous waste disposal and underground storage tanks. The Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, famously known as CERCLA or the Superfund Law, established deep liability for owners of contaminated land, regardless of whether they were responsible for the initial pollution. In California, the Department of Toxic Substances Control plays a proactive role in identifying and remediating these sites, which can drastically restrict the development potential of a parcel. Underground storage tanks represent another hidden danger, as leaks can lead to significant groundwater contamination, creating a financial liability that often exceeds the property's market value. When evaluating a potential purchase, a seasoned practitioner must consider these legacy environmental issues as potential deal breakers that require thorough due diligence. If a client ignores the possibility of a Superfund site or a decommissioned underground tank, they are effectively inheriting an unknown financial obligation that may not be covered by standard insurance policies. California presents a unique set of geographic risks that necessitate specialized disclosure forms covering seismic and fire hazards. The Alquist-Priolo Special Studies Zones Act prohibits the construction of most structures for human occupancy across the trace of an active fault, while the Seismic Hazards Mapping Act provides the framework to identify areas prone to liquefaction or landslides. These mandates culminate in the Natural Hazard Disclosure Statement, which acts as a consolidated report informing buyers if a property sits within a designated earthquake fault zone or a fire hazard severity zone. Wildland urban interface areas are increasingly scrutinized by insurers and regulators alike, making the transparency provided by the NHD statement a critical defensive tool for those operating in high-risk regional markets. Furthermore, the FEMA flood insurance rate maps provide the historical data necessary to determine whether a property is located within a flood zone, which usually triggers mandatory lender requirements for flood insurance. These environmental disclosures are not optional. They are structural requirements that, if omitted, provide the buyer with specific rescission rights that can dismantle a transaction long after the initial signing. The burden of transparency extends into the legislative realm via the California Environmental Quality Act, which mandates an assessment of the environmental impacts of proposed projects. For significant real estate developments, an environmental impact report is often required to analyze how a project might affect the surrounding ecosystem, infrastructure, and air quality. When a project is found to have no significant impact, the agency may issue a negative declaration, which effectively streamlines the approval process. As a licensee, understanding this procedural hierarchy is vital for clients involved in land development or commercial site acquisition, as the timing and cost of these environmental impact studies can dictate the success of a project. Failure to adhere to these reporting protocols often leads to litigation and injunctions, which can halt construction for years. By mastering these environmental regulations, you position yourself as a facilitator of informed decision-making rather than merely a participant in the exchange of paperwork. See you in the next section. Welcome to our exploration of agency relationships and the professional duties that govern your conduct as a licensee in California. In this chapter, we will dissect the legal framework of agency, the fiduciary obligations you owe to your clients, and how these relationships are properly created or terminated. The foundation of any real estate transaction in California is the agency relationship, which establishes a fiduciary connection between the principal and the agent. When you act as an agent, you step into a role that is governed by the fiduciary duties often remembered by the acronym COLDSISOR, standing for care, obedience, loyalty, disclosure, accounting, and confidentiality. The duty of care requires you to act with the level of competence expected of a reasonably prudent professional, ensuring you do not leave your client exposed to unnecessary risk due to negligence. Obedience means you must follow the lawful instructions of your principal, though you are never obligated to follow a command that would involve an illegal act or an unethical maneuver. Loyalty demands that you place your client's interests above your own or any other party, necessitating the disclosure of any conflicts of interest that might undermine that commitment. Disclosure involves keeping the principal fully informed of all material facts related to the property or the transaction that could potentially affect their decision-making process. While the duty of disclosure is broad, it is constrained by the duty of confidentiality, which requires that you protect your client's private information even after the agency relationship has concluded. Accountability, or accounting, mandates that you handle all money and property entrusted to you with the utmost integrity, ensuring accurate records and the prompt deposit of funds into appropriate accounts. You are essentially a steward of the principal's interests, and any failure to adhere to these standards represents a breach that can lead to license revocation and civil liability. These duties apply primarily to your principal, but you also owe third parties the duty of fairness and honesty, meaning you cannot intentionally misrepresent facts or engage in fraudulent activities regardless of whether they're your client. Agency is typically created through an express agreement, which is a written contract explicitly stating the nature of the relationship, such as an exclusive right to sell listing. However, agency can also be created through implication, where the conduct of the parties lead a reasonable person to believe that an agency relationship exists, even without a formal, signed document. We also see instances of ratification, where a principal reviews and approves the unauthorized actions of an agent after the fact, effectively making those actions legally binding and authorized. An agency by estoppel or ostensible agency may arise if a principal intentionally or negligently allows a third party to believe that another person is their authorized agent, thereby holding the principal liable for the agent's actions under certain conditions. Establishing the exact point of origin for an agency is critical, as it defines when your fiduciary obligations become legally binding and when your liability for the client's interests officially begins. The termination of an agency relationship can occur in several ways, most commonly through the completion of the objective, such as the successful closing of a property sale. Expiration of the agency is also common, as most listing agreements have a predefined term, after which the legal relationship ceases unless it is renewed. Naturally, the death or incapacity of either the broker or the principal terminates the agency, as the personal nature of the relationship cannot be transferred to heirs or successors automatically. Furthermore, the destruction of the property, such as total loss due to a natural disaster, makes the performance of the agency purpose impossible and effectively ends the legal obligations. Mutual agreement allows both parties to part ways before a contract expires, while revocation by the principal or renunciation by the agent remains a viable, albeit legally complex, way to end the relationship early if circumstances dictate. California law has very specific requirements for dual agency, which occurs when a broker or their salespersons represent both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. Because this inherently creates a conflict of interest, the law mandates informed consent from both parties, typically documented through a specific disclosure form sequence known as disclose, elect, and confirm. You must first provide the disclosure of agency relationship form, which explains the agency choices available. Then the parties must elect their desired representation. And finally, all parties must confirm that election in writing. Failure to follow this exact procedure is a common source of disciplinary action and lawsuits regarding breach of fiduciary duty. Single agency, conversely, is where the broker represents only one party, which is naturally less fraught with potential for conflict but still requires strict adherence to all fiduciary standards. The legal structure of the office involves the broker as the responsible party for all licensed activity, with salespersons acting as authorized agents working under that broker's license. In California, most salespersons are classified as independent contractors for tax purposes, though they remain employees of the broker for the purposes of workers' compensation and overall supervision. This hybrid status often confuses people, but the core reality is that you, as an agent, work for hire, and the broker is ultimately responsible for your conduct, misrepresentations, and compliance with professional standards. We also see the influence of the e-Sign Act and the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, which validate the use of electronic signatures and digital communications in real estate contracts. Ensuring that your digital practices are compliant with UETA is not just modern convenience. It is a legal requirement that keeps your electronic records admissible and binding in a court of law. Actual and constructive knowledge are conceptual pillars when determining your liability for misrepresentation during a transaction. Actual knowledge refers to facts that you are explicitly aware of because you have seen or heard them, while constructive knowledge assumes that you should have known something because it is a matter of public record or easily discoverable through a diligent inspection. If you claim ignorance of a material fact that should have been obvious during a reasonable visual inspection, you may be held liable for misrepresentation based on constructive knowledge. Implicit agencies can also arise when you behave as an agent for someone without a formal contract, which can trap a licensee in high-stakes liability before they have even realized a relationship has been formed. Understanding these concepts ensures you maintain a clean boundary between professional guidance and off-the-cuff remarks that could be legally interpreted as binding advice. See you in our next session. Welcome back to another session where we examine the essential components of managing risk through mandatory disclosures in California real estate transactions. In this chapter, we will master the intricacies of disclosure requirements to ensure you can protect your clients and your professional license. The foundation of California real estate practice rests upon the principle of caveat emptor being severely restricted by statutory disclosure requirements. As a licensee, your primary obligation is to conduct a reasonably competent and diligent visual inspection of the property to uncover material facts. The Transfer Disclosure Statement, or TDS, is the bedrock of this process for most residential properties consisting of 1 to 4 units. Sellers must complete this form honestly and in good faith, addressing the physical condition of the property, including any known defects or past repairs. While the seller is responsible for completing the statement, you're responsible for cross-referencing their claims with your own observations. If you spot a discrepancy or a potential issue that isn't noted, you have a duty to investigate further and disclose your findings. Failure to do so exposes you to claims of misrepresentation or even fraudulent concealment, which can lead to license suspension or civil litigation. Beyond the standard TDS, California requires specific disclosures regarding natural hazards that might affect a property's value or safety. The Natural Hazard Disclosure Statement, or NHD, identifies if a property sits within designated zones, such as wildfire risk areas, earthquake fault zones, or floodplains. These aren't merely suggestions. They are statutory mandates intended to give the buyer a clear picture of potential environmental risks. Parallel to these are local disclosures, such as Mello-Roos districts or special assessment zones, which inform the buyer about additional tax burdens. Sellers must also disclose if the property contains lead-based paint, particularly for homes built prior to 1978, as mandated by federal law. These documents serve as a buffer against future disputes by ensuring the buyer has actual notice of conditions that could influence their decision to proceed with the purchase. Specific rules regarding the history of the property can be particularly sensitive and require careful navigation. Death on a property is a material fact under California law if the death occurred within the last 3 years. You must disclose this information if asked directly by a buyer or if you have actual knowledge of it that would reasonably affect the desirability of the home. However, deaths occurring more than 3 years ago generally do not need to be disclosed, with the exception of deaths caused by the condition of the property itself. Suicide is usually handled with the same caution, as it is generally wise to err on the side of disclosure to avoid claims of concealing a material fact. Always document your disclosures in writing and have your clients acknowledge receipt of these documents to create an audit trail of your transparency and adherence to professional standards. Financial and technical compliance forms, such as FERPTA and California withholding requirements, are strictly enforced to ensure tax obligations are met. Under the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act, buyers must withhold a portion of the purchase price from non-resident alien sellers unless an exemption applies. Similarly, California law requires state withholding on conveyances of real estate by non-residents to ensure collection of applicable capital gains taxes. These forms are not just paperwork. They're legal instruments that prevent the transferee from becoming liable for the transfer's unpaid tax debts. You will often encounter other technical requirements like smoke detector compliance and water heater bracing certifications. While these may seem like minor items, they are mandatory safety conditions that verify the property meets current building codes before the deal closes. The Agent Visual Inspection Disclosure, or AVID, serves as your personal statement of what you observed during your walkthrough of the property. It is distinct from the seller's disclosures because it represents your professional, unbiased assessment of the property's state. When documenting your findings, you must avoid speculative language and stick to objective, observable facts about the condition of the home. If you notice a red flag, such as unusual patches of water damage or cracks in the foundation, your duty is to report the observation, not to diagnose the structural cause. This distinction is critical because diagnosing structural integrity is the job of a licensed professional inspector rather than a real estate agent. By sticking to your visual observations, you maintain the boundaries of your agency role while meeting your legal obligation to provide full disclosure. The consequences of failing to meet these strict disclosure requirements are significant and can result in the rescission of the entire sales contract. A buyer who feels misled by a lack of disclosure regarding a material fact can sue for damages, which may include the cost of repairs, devaluation of the property, or punitive damages if fraud is proven. Fraudulent concealment occurs when a seller or agent knowingly hides a fact that would have influenced the buyer's decision. Rescission essentially unwinds the transaction, returning both parties to their pre-contract positions, which is expensive and often debilitating for all involved. Protecting against these outcomes starts with a rigorous, consistent approach to every file and every interaction with the buyer or the seller. By maintaining professional standards, you not only insulate yourself from liability, but also contribute to the integrity of the overall market. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back, and let's dive into the essential protocols for handling trust funds in California. This chapter is designed to ensure you understand the strict fiduciary duties regarding client money, which is a critical topic for your DRE exam. Trust funds are essentially any money received by a broker on behalf of another person, such as earnest money deposits, rent payments, or security deposits. When a broker receives these funds, they act not as an owner, but as a fiduciary, necessitating a neutral depository requirement. California regulations demand that these funds be placed in a trust account that is separate from the broker's personal or general business operating accounts. This separation is the cornerstone of legal compliance, as it protects client capital from the broker's personal creditors or business liabilities. The 3-business-day rule is a fundamental constraint you must memorize, as it dictates that all trust funds must be deposited into the designated account or delivered to the escrow holder within 3 business days of receipt. Failing to adhere to this timeline is a common source of DRE disciplinary actions and indicates a significant administrative lapse. You must view these funds as sacred, meaning any loss or mishandling, even if unintentional, falls squarely on the shoulders of the broker. By maintaining this professional distance, you ensure that transactions remain transparent and legally sound for all parties involved in the real estate process. The most serious violation in this domain is commingling, which is the act of mixing personal or general business funds with protected trust funds. It is a strictly prohibited practice because it blurs the line between ownership and agency, often serving as a precursor to even more dangerous violations. Conversion is the next, more severe stage of this malpractice, where the broker actually uses the client's money for personal expenditures or operational costs. Since the broker is holding these funds in trust, any utilization of that money for anything other than the benefit of the beneficiary is considered theft. DRE audits will specifically look for evidence of such practices by scrutinizing your ledger and bank statements to ensure that the balance of the trust account matches the sum of the individual beneficiary records. If you represent the client, you are legally responsible for any mismanagement, even if a salesperson under your supervision is the one who actually mishandled the funds. Disciplinary outcomes for these violations are severe and frequently result in license suspension or permanent revocation, effectively ending a professional real estate career. Therefore, maintaining a rigid boundary between your money and your client's money is not just a best practice, but a legal mandate for your continued licensure. Record keeping is the technical backbone that supports your legal compliance and provides defense during a DRE audit. You are required to maintain detailed, accurate, and up-to-date records, typically utilizing a columnar system that tracks every deposit and withdrawal by individual beneficiary. Modern systems allow for electronic record storage, but the digital infrastructure must be secure, redundant, and easily accessible to auditors upon request. These records must be retained for at least 3 years, covering all aspects of the trust account activity. A critical requirement is the monthly reconciliation process, where the broker verifies that the bank statement balance matches the sum of individual client ledgers and the adjusted checkbook balance. If there is a discrepancy, it must be identified and resolved immediately, as unexplained variances are red flags for regulatory bodies. When dealing with interest-bearing accounts, you must ensure that there is explicit, written permission from the beneficiary and that the broker is not personally profiting from that interest. Regarding promissory notes or uncashed checks, these must be recorded with the same level of granular detail as liquid cash, held securely, and documented clearly in the transaction file. Proper organization allows the broker to demonstrate that they are acting in the best interest of their clients, thereby insulating the firm from accusations of malpractice or professional negligence. See you in the next lecture. Welcome. In this chapter, we explore the essential pillars of real estate contracts and the professional standards that govern their execution in California. Mastering contract law is the single most effective way to secure your license and protect your future clients from unnecessary litigation. This chapter provides a rigorous breakdown of how valid agreements are structured, the specific nuances of California residential purchase agreements, and the ethical requirements that sustain professional conduct. By understanding the difference between void, voidable, and unenforceable agreements, you'll gain the clarity needed to navigate complex negotiations with confidence. We focus on the practical application of law, ensuring you can identify key components like consideration, lawful object, and mutual consent in any real estate document. Our goal is to transform confusing legal jargon into a clear mental framework that you can apply immediately to your exam questions and your professional practice. At the core of every binding agreement stand the essential elements of a contract, starting with capable parties and ending with a lawful objective. To be legally binding in California, a contract must involve parties who are of legal age and possess the mental capacity to understand their obligations. Mutual consent, often referred to as a meeting of the minds, is evidenced through the offer and acceptance process where both sides express unqualified agreement to the terms. Consideration must be present, though it does not strictly have to be monetary. It simply represents something of value exchanged between the parties to sustain the legality of the promise. Furthermore, California law requires that any contract for the sale of real estate must be in writing to be enforceable, a principle strictly upheld by the statute of frauds. If any of these foundational elements are missing, the contract may be classified as void from its inception, meaning it has no legal effect whatsoever. Conversely, a voidable contract is one that appears valid but can be rejected by one or both parties due to defects like duress, fraud, or lack of capacity. Unenforceable contracts are those that might be valid but cannot be enforced in a court of law due to technical flaws, such as missing signatures or failure to comply with the writing requirements mentioned earlier. Distinguishing between the status and nature of agreements is vital for your understanding of professional conduct and liability. An executory contract is one where the terms have been agreed upon, but the obligations remain to be performed, whereas an executed contract denotes that all parties have fully completed their duties. When looking at the structural flow, we classify agreements as either bilateral, where both parties make a binding promise to each other, or unilateral, where one party makes a promise in exchange for a specific act by another. Typical listing agreements fall under this scope, ranging from the open listing, which allows multiple brokers to compete, to the exclusive agency or exclusive right to sell. The latter is preferred by brokers because it ensures a commission regardless of who finds the buyer, provided it occurs within the specified term. We must also be wary of net listings, which are legally permissible in California, but fraught with ethical risks because the broker keeps everything above a predetermined net price, often creating a conflict of interest. Safety and holdover clauses are included to protect the broker's right to a commission even after the listing period expires, provided the property is sold to someone who is introduced to the property during the contract term. The mechanics of the California Residential Purchase Agreement involve complex processes including contingency removal, notice to perform, and arbitration clauses. A contingency, such as an inspection or financing clause, acts as a protective shield for the buyer, but these must be actively removed by specific deadlines to keep the contract binding. When a party fails to meet these deadlines, the other side may issue a notice to perform, which grants a formal grace period before they can declare default. Should a breach occur, the remedies available include specific performance, where a court forces the party to fulfill the deal, or compensatory damages to cover the losses incurred. We also see mutual rescission, where both parties agree to dissolve the contract, essentially hitting the reset button. Assignment and novation represent two different paths. assignment transfers the rights of the contract to a third party, whereas novation replaces an old contract with an entirely new one, completely discharging the original parties from their previous obligations. By understanding these instruments, you are better equipped to advise clients on how to protect their interests while maintaining the high ethical standards required in the field. I look forward to our next session together as we continue our study. Welcome to this chapter on general ethical practices, where we will define the standards of conduct expected of a California real estate licensee. We will explore the intersection of regulatory mandates and professional integrity to ensure you are fully prepared for the exam. In the world of professional real estate, the distinction between the NAR Code of Ethics and the specific DRE regulations is often a source of confusion for candidates. While the NAR Code of Ethics represents a voluntary commitment to higher standards for members of the association, DRE regulations are the mandatory laws that govern every licensee in California. Article 12 of the NAR Code specifically addresses truthfulness in advertising, demanding that all representations be accurate and transparent. From the perspective of the DRE, advertising must never be misleading or deceptive, regardless of whether a property is listed under an MLS or by private sale. If you misrepresent a property's features or mislead a potential buyer about the terms of a deal, you are not merely violating an association's soft policy, but running afoul of the Business and Professions Code. Being accurate in your marketing is not just about professionalism. It is a legal requirement that protects the public and your own license. Interacting with other brokers requires a disciplined adherence to professional courtesy, which serves as the bedrock of a functioning marketplace. When handling multiple offers, a licensee must act with extreme diligence, ensuring that every seller is fully informed of the terms of each offer presented. The sequence of presentation matters greatly because failing to present an offer promptly can be construed as a violation of your fiduciary duty. If a broker receives 10 offers on a property, they must treat each participant with impartiality and ensure the seller sees every single one before making a decision. Professional courtesy dictates that you communicate clearly and honestly with cooperating brokers, avoiding any gamesmanship that could jeopardize your client's interests. This systemic approach to offer management minimizes the risk of legal fallout and upholds the integrity of the real estate transaction process. When we shift our focus to agency conduct, we must address the issue of undisclosed profit, which remains a primary target for disciplinary action. A licensee must always act in the best interest of their client, which explicitly prohibits the acceptance of undisclosed compensation, rebates, or secret profits. You are strictly required to disclose your license status whenever you act as a principal in a transaction, such as buying or selling property for yourself or an entity you control. This disclosure must be made in writing to all other parties to ensure there is no confusion regarding your role and potential incentives. If you participate in a deal where you stand to gain financially beyond your agreed-upon commission, failing to disclose that fact is a direct breach of your agency obligations. Simply put, any secondary financial interest in a transaction must be brought into the light before any contracts are finalized. The burden of supervision remains a critical component of the broker-salesperson relationship under the DRE framework. A broker must exercise reasonable supervision over all salespersons, which includes reviewing their contracts, disclosures, and advertising materials for compliance. When a salesperson makes an error or engages in questionable conduct, the broker who failed to supervise is often held jointly responsible by the DRE. If you observe a violation of law or ethical standards within your office, you have an obligation to address it immediately to protect the brokerage and the public. Conflicts of interest must be identified early and resolved or properly disclosed, as the law does not permit a licensee to serve two masters without the express consent of all involved parties. This structure of oversight ensures that the actions of individual agents reflect the standard of the entire profession. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to this chapter on disciplinary actions and fair housing, where we refine your understanding of professional conduct and civil rights within the industry. We will explore the regulatory oversight of the DRE and the critical legal protections ensuring equal housing opportunity. The Department of Real Estate initiates an investigation process whenever a formal accusation is filed or when the commissioner has reasonable cause to believe a violation of the real estate law has occurred. This process often involves an administrative law judge who hears evidence and makes findings based on the preponderance of evidence standard. If a licensee is found to have committed a violation, the commissioner may issue a range of penalties, such as a public reprimand or a fine, though more severe cases leading to license suspension or revocation are common. A significant aspect of this system is the Real Estate Recovery Fund, which provides a measure of relief to members of the public who have obtained a final court judgment against a real estate licensee for fraud, misrepresentation, or deceit. There are strict criteria for eligibility and specific payout limits per transaction or per licensee, and any licensee whose conduct results in a payout must reimburse the fund in full, with interest, before they can even be considered for license reinstatement. Reinstatement often requires fulfilling additional education requirements in ethics and legal compliance to ensure the licensee understands the gravity of their previous professional failures. Common violations that trigger these disciplinary proceedings typically center on breaches of fiduciary responsibility and statutory obligations. Misrepresentation and false promises are frequently cited, as they directly undermine the integrity of the transaction and the trust inherently placed in the licensee. Trust fund abuse remains one of the most serious administrative offenses, involving the commingling of personal and professional funds or the conversion of client money for unauthorized purposes. Negligence, while sometimes appearing less malicious than overt fraud, still demonstrates a fundamental inability to perform duties at the level required by the licensing standards. Criminal convictions that involve moral turpitude or acts that bear a substantial relationship to the qualifications of being a broker or salesperson are heavily scrutinized by the department. The commissioner does not need to prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt in these administrative hearings, as the goal is consumer protection rather than criminal punishment. Understanding these boundaries is the first step in ensuring your career as a California real estate professional remains beyond the reach of the disciplinary board. Fair housing compliance is not merely an optional best practice, but a comprehensive legal framework rooted in the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the landmark Jones versus Mayer case, which affirmed that the prohibition against racial discrimination is absolute. The Fair Housing Act, including subsequent amendments, expanded these protections to prohibit discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and disability in the sale, rental, and financing of housing. California law goes further by incorporating specific protected classes such as sexual orientation, gender identity, and source of income, which are essential for every agent to recognize in daily operations. These protections prevent property owners and real estate practitioners from engaging in steering, blockbusting, or discriminatory advertising that would limit the housing choices of protected groups. While there are narrow exemptions for certain types of housing, such as specific senior communities that meet HUD standards or owner-occupied dwellings with a limited number of units, these are rare and interpreted strictly by the courts. Compliance testing is frequently conducted by the government and private advocacy groups to ensure that agents treat all clients with the same level of service and professionalism. Every transaction you handle depends on your commitment to these ethical and legal standards, which serve as the foundation of your professional reputation. If you maintain a rigorous adherence to fair housing practices and ethical mandates, you will naturally avoid the pitfalls that lead to administrative disciplinary actions. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome to the chapter on appraisal. We will examine the core principles and methodologies professional appraisers use to determine property value in California. In this chapter, You will master the fundamental concepts that define value in the eyes of the law and the market. Appraising is not about guessing. It is a rigorous, structured exercise in logic. We focus on the distinction between value and cost, as these are often conflated by beginners. Value is an economic concept, which we categorize as either use value or exchange value. Market value represents the most probable price a property should bring in an open and competitive market. Conversely, market price is simply the amount of money actually exchanged. Cost refers to the historical or current dollars spent on labor and materials to create an improvement. Understanding these boundaries is your first step toward true competency in real estate valuation. The appraisal process follows a strict sequence to ensure reliability and consistency. We begin by defining the problem, which identifies the property, the purpose of the appraisal, and the effective date of the valuation. Next comes extensive data collection, where we look at both specific data related to the property and general data regarding the regional economic climate. We then proceed to analysis, which includes determining the highest and best use of the land. This is the use that is physically possible, legally permissible, and financially feasible, resulting in the highest present value. Finally, we move toward reporting our findings in a document that meets the standards of the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, or a SPAP. Appraisals are grounded in several governing principles, most notably supply and demand. If demand is high and supply is limited, values rise accordingly. The principle of substitution holds that an informed buyer will pay no more for a property than the cost of acquiring an equally desirable substitute. We also evaluate the principle of contribution, which measures how much a specific improvement adds to the total value of the property. Principles like progression and regression describe how neighboring properties influence the value of the subject real estate. When a lesser home sits among mansions, its value is pulled upward. Similarly, a luxury home in a neighborhood of modest houses experiences regression. Each of these principles functions as a check on our final estimate. The four elements of value, often remembered by the acronym DUST, constitute the foundation of economic worth. These are demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. A property must have utility, meaning it serves a specific function for the user. It must also be scarce, as an abundant resource with no rarity carries little market value. Transferability ensures that the property rights can be legally moved from one owner to another. Without these four elements, a property lacks the components necessary for market-recognized value. We must analyze how these elements interact within the current economic environment to reach a defensible number. We employ three main approaches to value, with the sales comparison approach being the most common for residential units. This method relies on analyzing recent sales of similar properties in the immediate vicinity to adjust for differences in features or timing. The cost approach involves calculating the replacement cost of a structure, subtracting the depreciation, and adding back the land value. Depreciation is broken down into three types: physical deterioration, functional obsolescence, and economic obsolescence. Physical deterioration is simple wear and tear, while functional obsolescence relates to design flaws like outdated floor plans. Economic obsolescence focuses on external factors, such as a noisy airport being built nearby, which are entirely outside the owner's control. For income-producing properties, we utilize the income capitalization approach. This method converts anticipated future income streams into a present value, typically using a capitalization rate. We use the IRV formula, where income equals the rate times value, to solve for any missing variable. The gross rent multiplier and gross income multiplier are simpler tools used for rough estimates, comparing the price to gross income. Direct capitalization is a more precise technique for stable properties. The selection of a proper capitalization rate is the most critical decision in this approach because a minor discrepancy in the rate leads to a significant divergence in the final value. The final step is reconciliation, where the appraiser reviews the findings from the different methods used. Not every approach is equally valid for every property type. We assign more weight to the method that best reflects the reality of the market. Beyond the math, we must uphold professional standards regarding independence and integrity. The Home Valuation Code of Conduct and the Dodd-Frank Act significantly changed the landscape to prevent outside influence or coercion on the appraiser. Fraudulent appraisal practices are subject to severe regulatory penalties, and the appraiser must always maintain a position of neutrality. The resulting report provides the final estimate, documented with both objectivity and technical accuracy. See you in the next session. Welcome to this deep dive into the California real estate finance markets, where we will clarify how capital moves from lenders to borrowers. We will examine the structured relationship between primary and secondary mortgage markets, ensuring you understand the mechanics of how loans are originated and subsequently sold to investors. To understand the primary mortgage market, consider the direct channel between the borrower and the institutional or non-institutional lender. Banks, savings and loan associations, and credit unions act as the primary engines here, using their own funds or deposited capital to write mortgages for consumers. Conversely, mortgage bankers operate slightly differently by using their own capital or credit lines to originate loans, which they then typically sell off in the secondary market. Mortgage brokers, by contrast, do not fund the loans themselves, but function as intermediaries who facilitate the process between the applicant and the ultimate lender. This distinction is critical for your examination, as understanding who holds the risk versus who receives the origination fee simplifies many scenarios involving institutional versus non-institutional lenders like private parties. Once a loan is originated, it often transitions into the secondary mortgage market, which serves as a global marketplace for buying and selling existing mortgage debt. Entities such as Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Ginnie Mae are the primary players that purchase these loans from the initial lenders to provide liquidity to the financial system. By pooling these individual mortgage loans into securities, a process known as securitization, these entities allow investors to purchase shares that are backed by the underlying mortgage payments of borrowers. This securitization mechanism is the backbone of the American home financing system, allowing local banks to replenish their capital and continue issuing new loans to the public. If you visualize Ginnie Mae specifically, remember that they primarily guarantee mortgage-backed securities that feature government-backed loans, such as those from the FHA or VA. The broader economic environment is dictated largely by the Federal Reserve, which manages the money supply and influences interest rates through several specific tools. Their most direct mechanism is the discount rate, which is the interest rate charged to commercial banks for loans received from the Federal Reserve Bank. When they adjust the reserve requirements, the amount of cash banks must hold in their vaults, they directly constrain or expand the amount of money available for lending. Of equal importance are open market operations, where the Fed buys or sells government securities to effectively control the federal funds rate. These actions ultimately filter down to the mortgage rates you see on the street, directly impacting whether a market segment leans toward inflation, where borrowing is expensive, or deflation, where credit might become stagnant. Underwriting these loans involves a systematic risk assessment process where lenders determine the qualification of the borrower based on established standards. The debt-to-income ratio is a primary metric, comparing the borrower's monthly debt payments against their gross monthly income to predict future capacity to repay the mortgage. Lenders also scrutinize credit scores to judge historical financial behavior, while the loan-to-value ratio helps identify the equity stake an owner has in the collateralized property. When a borrower lacks a substantial down payment, they're often required to pay private mortgage insurance, or PMI, to protect the lender should the borrower default. You should be familiar with the cancellation rights for this insurance, which generally allows the homeowner to request termination once the loan-to-value ratio reaches a specific statutory threshold. Beyond standard institutional paths, the market includes various niche vehicles like seller financing or land contracts, where the financing is handled entirely outside of a traditional banking institution. In a contract for deed, the seller retains legal title while the buyer gains equitable title and makes payments directly to the seller until the purchase price is amortized. Wraparound mortgages add another layer of complexity where a new mortgage interest incorporates an existing underlying loan, which is often utilized when traditional financing is unavailable. These mechanisms are often categorized as hard money lending or private money financing, where the focus is heavily weighted toward the value of the property collateral rather than the borrower's traditional income metrics. Understanding these alternatives will help you advise clients on different transaction structures that might not involve a commercial bank at all. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to this exploration of secured transactions and the mechanics of foreclosure in California. In this chapter, we will dissect the legal structures of debt, the roles of parties involved, and the specific processes that govern the recovery of assets when default occurs. In California, real estate secured transactions primarily rely on the deed of trust rather than the traditional mortgage found in other states. The deed of trust creates a three-party security instrument involving the trustor, who is the borrower or property owner, the trustee, who holds legal title for the benefit of the lender, and the beneficiary, who is the lender providing the funds. The granting clause within this document conveys the legal title to the trustee, while the trustor retains equitable title and possession of the property. A crucial component here is the power of sale clause, which authorizes the trustee to sell the property without a court order if the trustor defaults on the underlying promissory note. This distinction is vital because it establishes the legal framework for non-judicial foreclosure, which is the most common method of resolving defaults in the state. By understanding how these three parties interact and how the power of sale facilitates swift recovery, you gain a foundational grasp of California finance. When a trustor fails to meet the obligations of the note, the lender has distinct legal pathways to recover the debt. Judicial foreclosure occurs through the court system and allows for a statutory right of redemption, which gives the borrower a period after the sale to reclaim the property by paying the full debt plus costs. In contrast, non-judicial foreclosure is a trustee sale triggered by the recording of a notice of default, followed by a mandatory reinstatement period where the borrower can catch up on missed payments. If the borrower fails to cure the default, a notice of sale is recorded and published, eventually leading to a public auction. Equity of redemption is the right of the borrower to pay off the debt and stop the foreclosure prior to the sale being finalized. Navigating these timelines is essential for understanding how the state balances the lender's need for security with the borrower's right to protect their equity. California provides significant protections to borrowers through its anti-deficiency laws and the one-action rule. The one-action rule generally mandates that a lender must exhaust the security of the property through a single foreclosure action before seeking any other personal judgment against the borrower. Furthermore, California statutes often prohibit deficiency judgments on purchase money loans for primary residences, meaning the lender cannot pursue the borrower for the remaining balance if the foreclosure sale price is less than the debt. However, these protections do not always apply in non-purchase money situations or commercial transactions, making the nuances of the loan type critical. Some lenders might attempt to circumvent standard procedures, but the Home Equity Sales Contract Act provides robust safeguards against predatory lending and techniques used during distressed property sales. You must recognize that these regulations are designed to prevent unfair practices during times of financial instability. The transfer of debt and the conditions of repayment introduce several clauses that fundamentally alter the relationship between the parties. An alienation clause, often referred to as a due-on-sale clause, allows the lender to accelerate the full balance of the loan if the borrower transfers the property without the lender's express permission. This prevents the unauthorized assumption of a mortgage, where a new buyer takes over the existing loan terms without a new qualification process. We also see subordination agreements, which allow a lender to voluntarily take a lower lien priority position, and defeasance clauses, which outline the process of releasing the property from the lien once the debt is paid in full. Prepayment penalties may exist to compensate the lender for lost interest when a loan is paid off early, but these are heavily regulated by state law. Understanding the balance between these contractual rights and legal limitations will allow you to better interpret the financial documents you will eventually encounter in practice. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. We are now entering the chapter dedicated to lending laws and the regulatory framework that governs mortgage financing. In the coming sessions, we will demystify the complex web of disclosures and protections designed to keep the California real estate market stable and transparent. Lending laws form the backbone of the consumer credit market, and understanding them is essential for any licensee navigating modern real estate transactions. The Truth in Lending Act, commonly referred to as Regulation Z, serves as the primary legislation ensuring that borrowers are clearly informed about the cost of credit. Central to this is the requirement for lenders to disclose the finance charge and the annual percentage rate, better known as the APR. Unlike a simple interest rate, the APR reflects the total cost of credit, including prepaid interest and loan fees, which provide a more accurate picture for the consumer. When you represent a client, you must recognize that these disclosures are not mere paperwork, but are fundamental instruments of consumer protection. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau serves as the primary enforcer of these rules, holding institutions accountable for transparency. By standardizing how these costs are presented, Regulation Z allows borrowers to compare mortgage offers across different lenders with a high degree of confidence. The regulatory landscape expanded significantly with the implementation of the TILA-RESPA Integrated Disclosure Rule. This rule replaced older, fragmented disclosure forms with the loan estimate and the closing disclosure to simplify the borrower experience. The loan estimate must be provided within 3 business days of a loan application, giving the borrower a clear breakdown of expected costs before they are fully committed to a transaction. Following this, the closing disclosure serves as the final accounting of the loan terms, typically provided 3 days before the actual loan consummation. These timing requirements are strict because they ensure that the borrower has adequate time to review the details and ask questions before signing final documents. A vital component here is the right of rescission, which, in certain refinancing scenarios, allows a borrower to cancel the loan within 3 business days after signing. Understanding these timelines is a professional necessity because missing these deadlines can derail an entire settlement process, leading to delays that affect both buyers and sellers. Beyond disclosure requirements, federal and state laws strictly prohibit discriminatory and predatory lending practices. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act is a cornerstone of this effort, as it bars lenders from discriminating based on protected classes such as race, color, religion, or national origin. This ensures that creditworthiness remains the sole metric for loan eligibility rather than prejudice disguised as financial criteria. Closely related is the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which requires lenders to collect and disclose loan data to help detect redlining, where institutions might otherwise avoid lending in specific neighborhoods. We must also consider the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, which explicitly prohibits kickbacks for settlement services. Section 8 of this act is particularly critical because it forbids any person from giving or accepting anything of value for the referral of settlement business. While affiliated business arrangements are permitted under specific conditions, they must be transparently disclosed to the client to avoid conflicts of interest. California adds a layer of granularity to these federal rules, specifically through statutes like the Mortgage Loan Disclosure Statement. This requirement remains a mandate for brokers who negotiate loans on behalf of others, ensuring the borrower receives a clear summary of the loan terms and costs specific to California practice. Furthermore, we must look at usury laws, which place limits on the interest rates that can be charged on loans, though there are significant exemptions for real estate loans arranged by licensed brokers. These exemptions are intended to keep capital flowing through the mortgage market while still protecting consumers from truly predatory rates. It is also important to mention the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which mandates accuracy in the reporting of credit information by consumer reporting agencies. When clients seek your advice on financing, being aware of these requirements allows you to better guide them through the escrow and settlement process safely. Compliance isn't just about avoiding penalties. It is about maintaining the integrity of the professional relationship you hold with your client. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome to our deep dive into government-backed lending programs that constitute a significant portion of the California real estate market. We will analyze the mechanics of FHA, VA, CalVIT, and CalHFA loan programs to ensure you understand their unique requirements for the licensing exam. Government loan programs differ fundamentally from conventional mortgages because they are either insured or guaranteed by a federal or state agency rather than being purely private risk instruments. The Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, does not lend money directly, but instead insures loans originated by approved lenders. This insurance protects the lender against losses in the event of borrower default, which encourages those lenders to offer more favorable terms, such as a lower minimum down payment. The Section 203B program remains the most common FHA product, designed for 1 to 4 family residences. A critical distinction here is the mortgage insurance premium, or MIP, which is required on most FHA loans regardless of the loan-to-value ratio. Unlike private mortgage insurance, which can potentially be canceled once a certain equity threshold is met, the upfront and annual MIP often persists throughout the life of the loan. Understanding this structure is essential because these programs are specifically geared toward assisting borrowers who might not meet the strict underwriting criteria of conventional lending. Veterans Affairs, or VA loans, provide a different form of credit enhancement through a government guarantee of the loan balance. This benefit is available to eligible veterans, active duty service members, and surviving spouses who qualify based on length of service or service-connected disability. The eligibility is evidenced by a certificate of eligibility, commonly known as a COE, which the lender must obtain to verify the extent of the guarantee. A unique aspect of VA loans is that the government guarantee essentially replaces the need for a traditional down payment, enabling borrowers to purchase homes with zero money down. In California, we also have the CalVIT loan program managed by the California Department of Veterans Affairs. CalVIT operates differently because it often uses a land contract structure where the department retains legal title to the property until the veteran pays off the loan. These loans are funded through state bonds, providing a localized alternative to the federal VA system that interacts specifically with the California housing market. California also offers various assistance programs through the California Housing Finance Agency, or CalHFA, designed primarily for first-time homebuyers. These programs frequently involve down payment assistance, or DPA, which usually takes the form of a subordinate loan that may be deferred or forgiven under specific conditions. Because these programs are targeted social policy vehicles, they come with strict constraints, including household income limits and property value caps. These limitations ensure that the state funds are directed strictly toward low to moderate income families who truly need help entering the homeownership market. When you encounter questions regarding these programs on the exam, remember that they are almost always tied to specific demographic or geographic criteria. You must be able to categorize these as auxiliary or secondary financing that gaps the difference between the buyer's liquid assets and the required capital for purchase. One area where government programs maintain much stricter oversight than conventional lending is in the realm of property condition and safety. Because the government is either insuring or guaranteeing the loan, they demand that the collateral meets minimum standards of habitability and safety. This necessitates specific government-required inspections that often go beyond the standard due diligence of a private buyer. If the property does not meet these standards, the lender will likely require repair requests to be satisfied before the loan can close. These conditions can be a friction point in a transaction, as they impose an additional layer of process that does not exist in conventional lending. Furthermore, you should note the distinction regarding assumability. Many government loans allow for the loan to be assumed by a qualified borrower, whereas conventional loans typically include a strict due-on-sale clause that triggers immediate repayment upon the transfer of title. Finally, we must touch upon the taxation aspects that influence the attractiveness of homeownership through these programs. Homeowners are generally permitted to deduct mortgage interest from their federal taxable income, though specific limitations on mortgage debt amounts apply under current tax law. Additionally, property taxes paid to local jurisdictions remain deductible for most homeowners, providing further financial incentive to hold real estate. When comparing these features to the benefits provided by government-backed loans, the synergy between subsidized credit and tax relief becomes apparent. These incentives are intended to stabilize communities by encouraging long-term ownership. Knowing how these tax code provisions interact with the financial structure of a loan is a core competency for any real estate professional in California. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will master the technical foundations of investment analysis and the complex tax implications inherent to California real estate. To understand the financial viability of a property, we must first focus on net operating income, or NOI. This is the bedrock of investment analysis, calculated by taking the gross income a property generates and subtracting all necessary operating expenses. It is crucial to note that operating expenses include costs like property management, taxes, and maintenance, but they explicitly exclude debt service or principal payments. Unlike operating expenses, capital expenditures involve investments in the property that increase its useful life, such as a new roof. These functions allow us to calculate the capitalization rate, which serves as a vital indicator of a property's value by dividing the NOI by the current market purchase price. A higher cap rate generally suggests a higher risk profile, while a lower cap rate typically hints at a more stable asset in a prime location. When we shift our focus to leverage, we are examining how borrowed money influences the overall return on an investment. Positive leverage occurs when a yield on an investment exceeds the cost of the borrowed capital, effectively multiplying the return for the investor. Conversely, negative leverage manifests when the interest rate on the debt is higher than the internal rate of return, which can quickly erode equity. We use the debt service coverage ratio to determine if a property produces enough income to cover its loan payments. A ratio below 1.0 indicates that the property is essentially losing money on a monthly basis, which is a major red flag for any prudent lender. By maintaining a healthy margin between income and total debt costs, an investor secures the financial breathing room necessary to withstand market corrections or unexpected vacancies. Taxation in real estate is a structural discipline governed by the IRS, specifically regarding how we account for the decline in value of an asset over time. Depreciation, often called cost recovery, is the non-cash deduction that allows owners to spread the cost of an improvement over a set number of years. For residential rental property, the IRS mandates a straight-line depreciation schedule of 27.5 years, meaning you deduct a fraction of the building's value every single year. You must be careful to distinguish between land and improvements, as land is theoretically permanent and is never depreciated. If you miscalculate your adjusted basis by failing to account for past depreciation, you risk significant issues with the tax authorities when calculating capital gains upon the eventual sale. The 1031 exchange is perhaps the most powerful tool for wealth preservation in the California market, provided you follow the strict requirements. It allows an investor to defer capital gains taxes by swapping one investment property for another that is considered like kind. The process requires a qualified intermediary to hold the funds, as the taxpayer cannot take constructive receipt of the proceeds from the initial sale. You must adhere to tight identification rules, typically within 45 days, and close on the replacement property within 180 days. Any cash or debt relief received during this cycle is known as boot, and that portion is taxable in the year of the exchange. This mechanism is essentially a tax-free reinvestment engine that permits investors to scale their portfolios without triggering a massive tax liability at every closing. Finally, we must address how the tax code views personal and investment sales, including the primary residence exclusion. Individual taxpayers may often exclude significant portions of their capital gain from the sale of their primary home if they have met ownership and usage tests. This works quite differently from investment properties, which are subject to capital gains tax treatment unless deferred through other sophisticated methods like installment sales. An installment sale allows the seller to spread the receipt of payments over several years, which can also spread the tax impact over a longer duration. We must also remain aware that estate and gift taxes can dramatically affect high net worth real estate holdings if not properly structured through trusts or other legal entities. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to this new chapter where we will analyze the practical mechanics of listing and selling properties under California regulations. You will master the workflow from initial prospecting and legal compliance to finalizing agreements and managing long-term client relationships. Effective prospecting starts with a deep understanding of regulatory hurdles like the National Do Not Call Registry and the Can-Spam Act, which dictate how you interact with potential sellers. You must establish a standard operating procedure for your communications to avoid heavy federal fines while securing listing agreements through data-driven presentations. When you approach a seller, providing a comparative market analysis, or CMA, serves as your foundation for establishing value based on recent successful sales of similar neighboring properties. Your presentation needs to be professional, emphasizing how your marketing strategies and expertise in MLS input rules will maximize exposure for their home. Remember that every advertisement you publish must include your DRE license number and comply with specific team name regulations to pass the scrutiny of the Department of Real Estate Oversight. Once you secure the listing, the focus shifts to internal coordination and rigid safety protocols during showing appointments and open houses. You are responsible for ensuring that your conduct protects the seller's interests and limits liability, especially when handling high-stakes scenarios involving multiple offers. When an offer arrives, your role is to guide the seller through the timeline, the merits of counteroffer strategies, and the implications of various contingencies like inspection or financing clauses. Documentation remains the backbone of this process, requiring precise file organization and record-keeping that aligns with broker supervision standards. Every document, from the initial purchase agreement to the final signatures, must be approved by your supervising broker to ensure the transaction remains legally sound under California law. Managing a transaction to its successful close involves intense attention to deadlines and clear communication between all parties involved in the escrow. You must act as the primary coordinator for inspections, ensuring that necessary disclosure requirements are met before the closing date to avoid potential litigation. Once the sale is finalized, your commitment to the client should not cease, as post-closing services and long-term retention strategies are what build a sustainable real estate business. Consider how referrals function within the state's legal framework, as you must strictly adhere to limitations regarding fee sharing and professional affiliations. By standardizing your office workflow and keeping meticulous records of signatures and delivery methods, you insulate yourself from the risk of administrative errors that could jeopardize your license or commissions. I look forward to our next session. Welcome back. In this chapter, we explore the intricate mechanics of the escrow and settlement process in California. When a purchase agreement is signed, the transaction does not simply jump from buyer to seller. Instead, we introduce a neutral third party known as an escrow agent to hold documents and funds until all terms are met. This role is essential because it decouples the interests of the buyer and seller, ensuring that neither party suffers a loss during the transfer of obligations. The escrow instructions serve as the primary source of truth, providing a detailed roadmap of every requirement that must be satisfied before the file can close. These instructions are binding, and any changes to the agreed terms necessitate formal amendments signed by all participating parties. Think of it as a code base where the state is protected by these rigorous documentation requirements. If a deadline shifts or a financial figure changes, we must explicitly codify that change through an amendment to maintain the integrity of the closing process. A significant portion of the escrow workload involves the calculation of prorations, which ensure that expenses are shared fairly based on the time each party occupied or owned the property. Property taxes, interest on existing debts, and homeowner association dues are standard line items that require careful adjustment in the final settlement statement. We generally utilize two primary methods for these calculations: the 30-day month method, which assumes every month has 30 days, and the actual day count, which is more precise based on the calendar. Regardless of the method, the goal is to align the financial responsibilities with the exact date of transfer. If a seller has prepaid taxes for the entire year, they receive a credit at closing for the days they will no longer own the property. This level of mathematical precision is non-negotiable, as it directly impacts the net proceeds for the seller and the cash requirement for the buyer. Title review is another critical function performed during the escrow period, often initiated by the delivery of a preliminary title report. This document reveals the current state of ownership and lists any liens, easements, or other encumbrances that could cloud the title. It is the responsibility of the escrow officer and the parties involved to resolve these clouds before the grant deed can be recorded. If an outstanding lien is discovered, the escrow officer will secure a payoff demand from the creditor to ensure the debt is settled at closing. Once all conditions, including funding the loan and clearing the title, are satisfied, the transition moves toward the final steps of recording the grant deed with the county. At this point, the settlement statement, which has evolved from older formats like the HUD-1 into the modern closing disclosure, serves as the final accounting. The actual disbursement of funds and the transfer of possession involve strict protocols to prevent fraud and errors. California law dictates which funds are considered legal tender, and escrow entities must verify that all deposits meet these stringent requirements before disbursement. This verification process protects the liquidity of the transaction and ensures that the broker and their clients are not subject to the risks of uncollected funds. Before keys are handed over, a final walkthrough is typically conducted, and practitioners must be cognizant of interim occupancy agreements if the transfer of possession does not align perfectly with the closing date. Should conflicts arise during this final stage, the escrow officer is bound to follow the dispute resolution procedures outlined in the original instructions. If a resolution cannot be reached, the process may involve cancellation, requiring a clear understanding of the rules regarding earnest money disposition. Escrow officers in California operate under a specialized licensing framework, which underscores the high level of professionalism required to handle these sensitive accounts. They are not merely messengers between the bank and the parties. They act as a fiduciary for the transaction itself. Their duties encompass document preparation, the coordination of payoff demands, and the final accounting of the net proceeds. Whether you're dealing with a standard residential sale or a complex commercial transfer, the underlying principles of neutrality and adherence to instructions remain constant. By maintaining a clean paper trail and ensuring that every transaction adheres to state-mandated protocols, we can minimize the risk of litigation and successfully reach the closing finish line. I look forward to our next session. Welcome to our deep dive into property management and leasing. We will explore the specific responsibilities and legal safeguards required for managing residential and commercial assets in California. Property management is defined by the agency relationship between an owner and a manager, governed by a written management agreement that clearly defines the scope of authority. When you step into this role, your primary objective is to preserve the value of the physical asset while maximizing income for the owner through effective maintenance and strategic financial reporting. You will need to prepare comprehensive operating budgets that account for recurring expenses like taxes and insurance while planning for capital improvements. Setting market-consistent rents requires a thorough analysis of competing properties and vacancy rates in the local area. Marketing vacancies effectively is the next logical step, but this must always be balanced with strict adherence to fair housing compliance, ensuring that every applicant is treated with the same level of accessibility and procedural rigor. Tenant screening is perhaps the most critical task in risk mitigation, as it directly impacts property stability and cash flow. In California, you must be extremely familiar with different lease types, such as gross leases, where the landlord pays all expenses, versus net leases where the tenant covers taxes and maintenance, or percentage leases often used in retail settings. Beyond these contractual nuances, you must navigate complex landlord-tenant laws, including the nuances of the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, specifically AB 1482. This statute introduced statewide rent caps and strict just cause eviction requirements that apply to most rental properties built more than 15 years ago. Furthermore, you must adhere strictly to security deposit regulations, which mandate that all deposits must be accounted for and returned, minus any lawful deductions, within the 21-day window specified by state law. Maintaining a property involves the non-negotiable standard of the implied warranty of habitability, which requires the landlord to keep the premises in a condition fit for human occupation. If a landlord fails to address critical structural or safety issues, tenants may utilize the repair and deduct remedy or, in extreme cases, claim constructive eviction, where the tenant leaves because the property is physically uninhabitable. When a tenancy reaches a point of failure, the unlawful detainer process is the legal mechanism used to regain possession of the property. This begins with serving the appropriate notice, such as a 3-day notice to pay or quit, followed by the formal court process if the tenant remains in possession. You must strictly follow the legal timelines and service of process requirements, as failing to serve proper notice can lead to the dismissal of an eviction case, delaying the return of the property. In scenarios where a tenant abandons the property, you must follow specific abandonment procedures to regain clear title and possession. This includes notifying the tenant of their remaining personal property and holding it for a designated time before disposing of it, provided the value falls below specified statutory thresholds. Liability management remains a constant focus, requiring you to remain alert for hazards, such as lead-based paint or mold growth that necessitate formal tenant disclosures. For commercial properties, your agency duties will also encompass ADA compliance, ensuring that physical access standards are maintained for individuals with disabilities. Insurance is your final layer of protection, as property managers should ensure that the owner carries adequate casualty and liability coverage to mitigate the unpredictable nature of rental operations. Professionals seeking to distinguish themselves in this field often pursue designations like the Certified Property Manager or Accredited Management Organization, which focus on sophisticated asset management techniques. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will explore the diverse opportunities within specialized brokerage fields and how they relate to your future success as a licensed agent. Specialized brokerage allows licensees to move beyond standard residential transactions, tapping into niche markets that require a distinct set of regulatory knowledge. By mastering fields such as commercial real estate, business opportunities, and mobile home sales, you differentiate your professional offering in a competitive California market. We will examine how these specific sectors function, from the complexities of commercial lease analysis and expense stop provisions to the unique legal requirements of transferring a business, including assets and goodwill. You will learn the intricacies of the Uniform Commercial Code regarding bulk transfers, liquor license requirements through the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control, and the specific jurisdictional rules governing mobile home sales. Additionally, we will cover agricultural land rights, the nuances of water and mineral rights, the process of land subdivision, and the basics of syndication under securities law. This chapter is designed to provide you with the specialized competency necessary to pass the exam and build a long-term, scalable career. Commercial brokerage represents a shift from consumer-driven residential transactions to investor-focused asset management. In this arena, your primary goal is to understand how properties yield income and how expenses impact net operating income. You will frequently encounter lease analysis where the tenant is responsible for various operating costs beyond basic rent. Expense stop provisions are particularly critical here because they protect the landlord from rising operational expenses by setting a baseline cost that the tenant must pay if expenses exceed a certain threshold. Understanding these mechanics is not just about math. It is about protecting the landlord's yield and clarifying the tenant's exact recurring financial burden. Proficiency in vacancy factors and market absorption rates will further dictate how you evaluate the feasibility of office, retail, or industrial investments. Every commercial deal relies on the broker's ability to articulate these financial nuances clearly to sophisticated clients who view the property strictly as a capital asset. When dealing with business opportunity brokerage, you're not merely selling a lease or a building, but rather the intangible value of an ongoing commercial venture. The sale of business assets often includes not only the physical equipment and inventory, but also the goodwill, which represents the business's established reputation. In California, transfers involving inventory or equipment are strictly governed by the Uniform Commercial Code to prevent fraudulent transfers that could negatively affect creditors. You must be familiar with the bulk sale laws and the necessity of proper filing to ensure that all financial obligations are cleared prior to the transfer of ownership. If the business holds a liquor license, you have the additional layer of compliance with the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control. Failure to coordinate these filings correctly can invalidate the entire sale, leading to significant legal repercussions for both the buyer and the seller. Mobile home sales involve a specific set of rules that depend on whether the unit is considered personal property or real property. A mobile home becomes real property when it is affixed to a permanent foundation and the proper documentation is recorded with the county. If the unit remains movable, it is governed by laws administered by the Department of Housing and Community Development rather than standard real estate title procedures. Real estate licensees must be careful to distinguish between new units and used units, as the regulations regarding public reports and transfer disclosures differ significantly. Understanding the jurisdiction over these assets prevents common errors during listing agreements and escrow. Accurate disclosure regarding the status of the foundation is a fundamental duty, as it directly impacts how the buyer secures financing for the unit. Agricultural land sales require a working comprehension of rights that are often ignored in urban transactions, such as riparian and littoral water rights. Riparian rights pertain to land bordering flowing streams, while littoral rights apply to land bordering large, standing bodies of water like lakes. You should also be aware of the doctrine of appropriation, which allows for the diversion of water for beneficial use, even if the user does not own the land adjacent to the water source. Mineral rights are equally important, as they can be separated from the surface rights of the land, potentially creating complex ownership disputes if not addressed in the deed. When assisting a client with subdivision development, One must also account for zoning entitlements and environmental impact studies, which can drastically shift the timeline and cost of a development project. These specialized fields often require a collaborative approach with experts such as surveyors, soil scientists, and environmental consultants. Syndications offer real estate investors a way to pool capital for large projects, and this falls squarely under the purview of securities law. Because syndication involves selling a fractional interest in a venture, it is generally considered a security, which puts it under the regulation of both the California Department of Financial Protection and Innovation and federal authorities. While there are specific exemptions for real estate syndications, you must understand the basics of private placements and the importance of Form D and NASD filings to ensure compliance. Blue sky laws, which are state-level securities regulations, exist to protect investors from fraud and require that all promotional materials are truthful and transparent. Professional specialization in these sectors not only enhances your marketability, but ensures you handle high-level investment transactions with the standard of care required of a licensed California broker. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to this chapter on the transfer of real property, where we will rigorously dissect the legal mechanisms and formal requirements that govern how ownership shifts from one party to another in California. Our objective is to ensure you possess a precise understanding of the foundational principles of alienation, legal instruments, and the specific statutory procedures that render a transfer valid. Voluntary alienation is the process by which a property owner intentionally conveys their interest to another party, most commonly through a deed. To be legally binding, a deed must meet several essential requirements, including that the grantor be of sound mind and legal age, and that there is a clearly identified grantee. The grantor is the party transferring the interest, while the grantee is the recipient. Both must be competent to contract for the transaction to be enforceable under California law. Furthermore, the concept of delivery and acceptance is paramount, as a deed does not convey title until the grantor has intentionally delivered it and the grantee has accepted it. A grantor implies they possess the right to convey the property, and in the case of a grant deed, they also imply that the property has not been previously conveyed to anyone else and that it is free from undisclosed encumbrances. In contrast to the grant deed, a quitclaim deed is frequently used to release an interest in a property without providing any warranties or guarantees regarding the validity of the underlying title. These are often utilized to clear clouds on a title, such as settling a dispute over an easement or resolving a previous ownership claim that is deemed dormant. While a warranty deed provides extensive protection through various covenants and promises, it remains quite rare in California practice because title insurance provides superior practical protection. Instead, California relies heavily on the deed of trust, which acts as a security instrument, and the reconveyance deed, which the trustee uses to release that security interest once a loan is fully satisfied. Other specialized transfer instruments include a sheriff's deed, which arises from a court-ordered execution, and a tax deed, which occurs when a government entity conveys property following a tax sale due to delinquent payments. Sometimes, transfers occur by involuntary alienation, meaning the title shifts without the direct consent or intent of the current owner. Adverse possession is a significant example of this, where a claimant can potentially acquire title if they occupy the land for a continuous period of at least 5 years and fulfill specific requirements. The possession must be open and notorious, meaning it is visible enough that a reasonable owner should be aware of it, while also being hostile to the owner's interest and under a claim of right. Additionally, the claimant must have paid all property taxes throughout that 5-year period to satisfy the statutory threshold. Succession laws also dictate the movement of property when an owner dies, either through testate succession, where a valid will dictates the distribution, or intestate succession, which follows the laws of descent if no will exists. When a property owner dies without a will and has no identifiable heirs, the state may assert a claim to the property through the doctrine of escheat, which essentially places the property back under public ownership. Probate is the formal legal process used to administer and distribute a deceased person's estate, ensuring debts are settled and legal title is properly transferred to devisees or heirs. In natural environments, property boundaries can shift through accretion, which is the gradual buildup of soil, or avulsion, which is the sudden loss or gain of land due to forces like floods or earthquakes. These physical changes illustrate how environmental and geological events intersect with legal definitions like alluvion, which is the actual soil deposited, or reliction, the reseeding of water that leaves new land exposed. Understanding these concepts is essential because they form the baseline for how modern courts resolve disputes regarding the physical extent of real property. To facilitate these transfers, complex requirements exist for how property is described in a legal document, often necessitating precision that goes beyond simple street addresses. Notarization acts as a formal verification of the grantor's identity, providing a layer of security against fraud that the law demands for documents intended for public record. Acknowledgement is the process where a notary public confirms the signature on a document is voluntary and authentic, which is a prerequisite for recording the deed with the county recorder. Recording the deed creates constructive notice, which is a legal fiction that the public is made aware of the transaction by the mere fact that it is accessible in the public registry. This sequence prevents conflicts between simultaneous claimants, as the first person to properly record generally gains priority in the eyes of the law. Beyond simple land ownership, we must also account for tenements, hereditaments, and profits a prandra, which are secondary interests that can be transferred alongside or independently of the underlying soil. An easement, for example, is a right to use another's land for a specific purpose, and its transferability depends heavily on whether it is an easement appurtenant or held in gross. The assignment of these interests must be carefully documented to ensure the burden or benefit successfully attaches to the new owner, particularly in long-term commercial leases or restrictive covenants. Our focus throughout this domain is to recognize that title policy and ownership vesting serve as the primary mechanisms for shielding parties for financial loss. These elements ensure that any changes in ownership are not only legally effective, but also protected against claims that could jeopardize the buyer's investment. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today we are starting our review of the mathematical concepts that frequently appear on the California real estate examination. In this chapter, we will dissect the fundamental calculations that underpin every transaction and appraisal you will encounter in the field. Numerical proficiency is an often overlooked yet critical pillar of your success on the DRE licensing test. Many candidates fear the math section, but once you strip away the complexity, you find that it rests on a few core algebraic principles applied to real estate contexts. We begin by looking at commission calculations, which require a firm grasp of percentages and the specific splits between brokers and salespersons. A commission is rarely a flat fee, so you must be comfortable calculating the gross commission based on the sale price and then determining the individual cut based on the split percentage. For instance, if a property sells for $500,000 at a 5% commission, the total commission is $25,000. If the broker-salesperson split is 60-40, the salesperson receives $10,000. Always remember to identify the base number before applying your percentage, as shifting these factors is where most errors occur. This logic of identifying the base, the rate, and the total value applies to almost every mathematical problem you will face in this examination. Moving into property measurements, you will encounter problems involving square footage and acreage, which are foundational to valuation. You must memorize the constant conversion factor, as there are exactly 43,560 square feet in 1 acre. When asked to convert acreage to square footage or vice versa, this number should be the first tool you reach for in your mental toolkit. Volume calculations are slightly less common, but occasionally appear regarding storage or specialized structures. Remember that volume is simply length times width times height. When calculating property taxes, focus on the assessed value rather than the market value, as taxes are derived from the millage rate applied to that specific assessed figure. A millage rate is the tax rate per $1,000 of assessed property value. So expressing the rate as a decimal is your first required step. Understanding the ratio of assessed value to market value is essential, as the tax levy is always grounded in the assessed, not the fair market value of the property. Loan mathematics constitutes a significant portion of the quantitative section, requiring you to understand interest rates, loan-to-value ratios, and discount points. Simple interest calculations are generally the standard, though you should remain aware of how annual interest relates to monthly payments. The loan-to-value ratio is simply the mortgage amount divided by the lesser of the appraised value or the purchase price, a critical figure for underwriting. You will also see questions regarding discount points, where each point typically equals 1% of the loan amount, functioning as a way to buy down the interest rate. Origination fees function similarly to points, representing a percentage of the total loan amount charged by the lender for the administrative work of preparing the mortgage. Ensure you are clear on the difference between the principal reduction and the interest payment within an amortization schedule, as the early years of a loan are heavily weighted toward interest. These concepts interact to dictate the cost of borrowing, and being able to calculate the total interest paid over the life of a loan is a standard expectation for a licensee. The income approach to value is another area where you must be precise with your formulas, particularly regarding the determination of the net operating income. You derive the net operating income by taking the gross potential income, subtracting vacancy and credit losses, and then deducting all operating expenses. This is not the same as a mortgage payment, as debt service is excluded when calculating the net operating income, even if it is relevant to the buyer's personal cash flow. The capitalization rate, or cap rate, is the ratio of net operating income to the property's total value, expressed by the IRV triangle. In the IRV triangle, the I at the top represents income, while R and V at the base represent the rate and value, respectively. If you have any two of these variables, you can easily determine the third through simple division or multiplication. Understanding that value moves inversely to the capitalization rate is vital. As the cap rate increases, the indicated value of the property decreases if the income remains stable. Finally, we arrive at the mechanics of closing costs and prorations, which require careful attention to the calendar. You will need to decide whether to use a 360-day year, often called a statutory year, or a 365-day year for your prorations. Usually, the test will provide a preference, but if not, the convention is often to divide the annual amount by 12 for monthly figures and by 30 for daily figures when using the 360-day model. You are effectively balancing the ledger between the seller and the buyer by prorating items like paid property taxes, prepaid insurance, or accrued interest on an existing mortgage. Each item is either a debit or a credit, where a debit represents money the party must pay and a credit represents money they are receiving. By methodically listing every expense and dividing those expenses correctly based on the closing date, you can determine exactly how much cash the buyer must bring to the table and what the seller will walk away with. Always check your work for basic alignment, ensuring that the total debits and credits equate to the net amount exchanged. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back, as we reach the pinnacle of our journey toward mastering the California real estate examination. This final session is dedicated to synthesizing everything we have discussed and refining your tactical approach to the exam environment itself. // new. To truly excel on the DRE licensing test, you must shift your focus from abstract conceptual knowledge to precise, high-frequency recall and strategic test-taking mechanics. We have covered the vast landscape of California property law, agency duties, and financial instruments. But now we must ensure your brain can access this data under the pressure of a 4-hour duration. Start by reviewing your internal index of key terms, as the Department of Real Estate frequently uses synonymous terminology to test your foundational understanding. When you encounter a challenging scenario-based question, do not attempt to find the perfect answer immediately. Instead, utilize a systematic process of elimination to discard the obviously incorrect options. This approach reduces the cognitive load, allowing you to focus your analytical energy on the nuances between the two most plausible choices. Always look for distractor phrasing designed to lead you away from the core legal principle being tested, such as over-specific conditions that do not align with general statutes. If you find yourself stuck on a taxing math problem or a complex legal disclosure scenario, mark it for review and move on to preserve your mental stamina. Time management is not just about speed. It is about maintaining a consistent pace that allows you to address every question without risking fatigue-induced errors in the final hour. / new. As we approach the day of the exam, your preparation must extend to the logistical and physical requirements mandated by the testing centers. Familiarize yourself with the rigid protocols regarding prohibited items, as even a minor infraction involving electronic devices or unauthorized study materials can lead to an immediate disqualification. You must arrive early enough to navigate local parking and check-in procedures, ensuring that you enter the testing room with a stable, professional mindset. Remember that the exam center environment is sterile and strictly monitored, which can be disorienting if you're not mentally prepared for the silence and the proximity of other test takers. Utilize your allotted breaks strategically to reset your focus and perform brief physical movements, rather than attempting to cram additional facts during this time. Once the assessment concludes, understand the score notification process and the timelines for receiving your official results from the DRE. If you do not pass on the first attempt, familiarize yourself with the rescheduling rules before you leave the center, as knowing the administrative path forward will alleviate post-exam anxiety. / new. Securing your license is merely the initial step in a career that demands continuous intellectual and ethical engagement. Upon passing, you will soon navigate the initial 2-year renewal cycle, which requires specific mandatory education, including comprehensive courses on ethics, fair housing, and the critical assessment of implicit bias. These requirements are not bureaucratic hurdles, but essential components of professional development that ensure you remain compliant with the ever-evolving legislative landscape in California. Stay vigilant regarding updates to consumer protection laws, as the brokerage environment is dynamic and heavily reliant on current statutory compliance. Your commitment to these ongoing educational requirements, including the transition to 4-year standard renewal cycles after your first license issuance, defines your reputation as a competent practitioner. Ethics in real estate is a practical obligation that manifests in every contract, agency disclosure, and fiduciary act you perform for your clients. By maintaining a structured roadmap for your professional education, you ensure that your practice remains robust, legally sound, and focused on serving the public interest effectively. Mastery of the exam is the prerequisite, but your dedication to these standards will ultimately determine your long-term success in the California brokerage market. / new. I wish you the very best of luck as you prepare to pass your exam and begin your career. / new. See you in the next session.